Imagine drifting across 7 different planets, forced to start over again and again, until finally you find a place to settle. But that planet just happens to be Arrakis, one of the deadliest environments in the galaxy. And that's the legacy of the Fremen. Nomadic people shaped by centuries of displacement, and they've had to figure out ways to survive in the desert. And I think they've done a pretty good job at doing that. But what's interesting is that despite being nomads, the Fremen society is described as being hierarchical and structured without any formal laws. So how do you get such a stable society and all of the physical manifestations of an established culture when most of your time is focused on survival? The secret could be that the Fremen have a method of carrying with them everywhere they go these intricate rules and social practices with their tents. The Fremen were most likely inspired by the Arab Bedouins, so Herbert probably used their tents as a real-life reference as well. These tents were called bayt al-shar, aka the House of Hair. They were black tents crafted from goat hair that didn't just provide shelter, it breathes with the desert. The fabric absorbs heat during the day and it releases it at night. In rainy climates, the fabric swells to become waterproof and it reopens when it's dry. The Fremen tents obviously improve on this concept by integrating a moisture capturing system and reclaiming every single drop of sweat or breath, and by creating this symbiotic relationship between the environment and the person. These tents were also extremely versatile. They could be pitched within hours on dunes or slopes, using the terrain as wind barriers and by positioning the entrances to face away from the wind. In Dune 2, we can see what the Fremen tents look like as a collective, with a central structure with smaller modular pods extending off of them. And you can also see this modularity in the Bedouin tents as well. When families grew or shrank, new sections could be easily added by stretching these goat hair fabric over posts. But despite being a very open structure, they were still very effective in reinforcing social boundaries, with a simple divider. Division between men and women, family activities, and for hosting guests, division between communal space and private space. So in that sense, the tent is not just practical, it creates a framework for interactions. It's actually a dynamic and social space where they actively practice cultural values and norms. And most importantly, making sure that traditions are still held up even in the harshest desert environments. But of course, the Fremen do have more permanent homes. In fact, you could say the Fremen are troglodytes, aka cave dwellers. And despite having limited resources, they've engineered entire societies within natural rock formations, like caves or hills or rock faces. Herbert calls them small cities, and going there was a pretty immersive experience. All around him, Paul saw the Fremen throwing back their hoods, removing nose plugs, breathing in deeply. Paul then slipped out his nose plugs, and the odor of the place assailed him. Unwashed bodies, distillate esters, reclaimed waste, everywhere, the sour effluvia of humanity. And over it all, a turbulence of spice and spice-like harmonics. But then Farak took a deep breath. The smells of home. Now, just imagine this. These people find comfort in something that anyone else would find repulsive. So their identities, in a way, are tied together by the strongest possible glue. This shared sensory connection to this underground life. And these sietches were really elaborate systems. They had external wind traps for moisture collection and death stills for processing dead bodies, and entire sections for industry and culture and military, and even testing grounds for terraforming Arrakis. It sounds pretty sci-fi, but there is a real-world comparison. Cappadocia in Turkey, which is known for these unique geological features. This soft volcanic stone called tufa. This meant people could carve into the stone to create a natural shelter, creating entire communities within rock formations, like these not-so-subtle structure called fairy chimneys, which were hollowed out and used for homes or storage. But by far the largest, and maybe even the most comprehensive city, is the underground city of Derinkuyu. It's burrowed 280 feet deep into the ground, and it could house 20,000 people. And apparently it was rediscovered by accident in 1963 when a farmer knocked down a wall in his basement trying to look for his missing chickens. But Derinkuyu actually dates back thousands of years, the oldest written reference coming from 370 BC. But over the centuries, it was occupied and expanded by different civilizations, from the Phrygians to the Persians to the Christians of the Byzantine era. The Hittites are thought to have started the initial excavation, possibly creating the first few levels as a defensive refuge, with labyrinthine tunnels and hidden passages and narrow corridors designed to trap enemies. But by 1200 BC, the Phrygians took over and expanded it significantly, because they had these skilled Iron Age builders who knew how to build these elaborate underground facilities. They added things like rolling stone doors, which could seal off sections of the city and were only movable from the inside. The layers of the city were also strategic. On the top floors, they had things like livestock to reduce the smell and toxic gases, while also creating this warm layer of insulation for the colder months. Pretty smart. The inner layers had dwellings and schools and spaces for religious rituals, and even wine cellars. So if you're wondering, how on Arrakis did they print such a detailed underground city? Pretty much all of our 3D prints, we use the BambuLabs X1C 3D printer with the AMS module. We work pretty fast, so I really appreciate the speed and the quality and the precision of the prints. It's very reliable thanks to the dual automatic leveling and AI LiDAR and the vibration compensation system. And with the automatic material system, you can print multiple materials and colors at the same time. BambuLabs also has a very wide range of filaments to choose from. For this one, we use the PLA marble to get this earthy feel. And for this Harkonnen arena, we use the PLA metal. You can use different nozzle diameters that you can swap out to try to enhance the print quality, which is what we did for this Harkonnen arena, where we needed different levels of precision around the model. If you don't know what to make, you can check out MakerWorld because they have tons of ready-to-print models so you can get started right away. I'm always very surprised at how quickly we can go from a digital model to a physical model. So if you were into this kind of thing, check out the BambuLabs X1C printer. I'll leave the link in the description. The most important part of the city were these shafts that would move natural airflow between the dwellings. But these shafts also doubled as a part of the water system. They connected to a shared well, which was dug over 180 feet deep. So in addition to getting fresh water, it would cool the air before circulating it into the rest of the spaces. The city had around 50 of these shafts placed strategically to make sure fresh air circulated even to the deepest chambers. But it was also a line of defense. It was designed so you could control access from below, so if invaders tried to exploit it from the top, they could simply cut off the water supply. In Dune, we have a very similar contraption called wind traps. They trap and collect atmospheric moisture, which is actually more similar to bargeels used in hot, arid regions to cool buildings, to catch the wind and funnel it downward, and the pressure differential pushes the hot air out of the building. These wind traps would direct water moisture into a collection basin, which is arguably also the most important part of a Fremen siege, and therefore heavily protected from enemies. There's also some scenes in Dune that suggest that rather than being carved out of a natural cave, they could be built around something, suggesting maybe a slightly different construction method called lost formwork or sacrificial framework, where a structure is built around a framework, which is later removed, leaving just the outer shell. There's lots of different ways of doing this, but we tested one of the methods in our Batcave video, where we put up the wooden dowels and poured concrete around it, creating the exterior structure, and then burned the interior framework. Other variations include creating a concrete shell around inflatable bubbles and then deflating the bubbles, like in this building, or even using animals. In this case, they built a structure around a core of hay bales, and after the concrete had cured, they brought Paulina the cow to come in and hollow out the structure. But yes, the Fremen were resourceful, but they had to spend large portions of their time focusing on survival. So were these details carved painstakingly over generations and generations? Honestly, with their ingenuity with things like still suits, to me, it's the latter. Or it could be a mix of both. Either way, I think these sietches in so many ways are symbols of stability in a world that's transient. And every chamber, every system, it reflects a culture that sees survival as a collective endeavor. So a troglodyte life, it's not so bad. Especially if you want to survive on a place like Arrakis. They're natural defensive shelters, they're cooler, and they can retain humidity the deeper you go. And they can make you trip pretty hard. One of the most disturbing scenes from DUNE is this ritual of spice agony, which grants access to genetic memories from your forebears. And of course, there's weird parallels to reality. Caves were used in the past by hermits or yogis in India for meditation or prayer, but the most interesting, in my opinion, comes from the ancient Greeks. Ancient Greeks placed a lot of value on this quest for truth, which is why oracles and prophets were so important. Yet, they believed divine knowledge was almost impossible to experience if you had a body. This is a quote from Plato. The body is constantly breaking in upon our studies and disturbing us with noise and confusion. It prevents our beholding the truth. In fact, if we are ever to know anything absolutely, we must free from the body. And then only when we're dead, we're likely to possess the wisdom which we desire. Pretty wild, right? But caves were the solution to freeing the mind from the body's limitations, because they had these unique qualities to achieve an altered state of consciousness.
There's almost no light. Even the temperature and the humidity is really consistent. And the sound is completely dampened in here.
Essentially creating a natural sensory deprivation chamber. Apparently, under the conditions of sensory suppression, the mind can enter a state called stimulus hunger, where the brain tries to compensate for the lack of external stimuli by creating vivid imagery and even hallucinations. This is why the white room torture is so effective and it can leave permanent damage on your brain. They can also produce an effect called pareidolia, where the mind assigns meaning to random patterns. So maybe for the Fremen, it wasn't just the spice, but it was their troglodyte existence that gave them these spiritual experiences. Yet, the Fremen didn't just use caves in order to achieve some sort of higher power. They might have used it to maintain power as well. Let me explain. This is the quintessential example for what we consider a disciplinary space. According to the philosopher Michel Foucault, these structures are deliberately designed to exert control over people, using architecture as a tool to enforce power and authority. Makes sense, right? But this, and even this, were also examples of disciplinary spaces. And the key elements that qualify a disciplinary space, in a weird way, also apply to the Fremen sietches. Limited entry points that make surveillance much easier, like tunnels that direct movement and behavior. Spaces that are protected and isolated from the outside world, especially ones that foster a sense of collective responsibility. Partitioning used to separate people or activities so they can be both contained and supervised. Spaces that create routines and rules that enforce conformity and order. So the sietches aren't just defensive or functional, they actively shape Fremen society. The architecture instills discipline and order and social cohesion, subtly molding the behaviors and values of the Fremen. So what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments. If you're interested in our merch or bonus assets, check out the link in the description. And with that, I'll see you guys in the next video.